we'll get started. I'll just talk about what's going to happen next then. So this thing that I had over on the left-hand side here, I just put that up there for a bit of entertainment purposes. If you were logged in earlier and looking at it, you can scan your eyes down now and see some of the things that we're going to be talking about. What that great long list of things there is from is, it's a thing we wrote for some teachers just before the end of last term, and it was essentially because we do all this research with schools, both for clients and for ourselves, all the way through the year, and everything I'm sharing with you tonight is stuff that we've done for ourselves, so it's ours. Obviously we don't share the stuff we do for clients, but these comments here they're what teachers are telling us they're thinking about. These aren't verbatim quotes, as I say at the top, they're paraphrased, but they are the kinds of things that teachers are worried about. Not all of them are worried about all of them, obviously, but I'm going to be unpicking what some of those concerns are later on. But the main purpose of this really is to help you, if you have offerings for schools, to try to think about what some of the current issues are that might affect the way you develop your offerings, so whether that's free resources that you host on your website or publish via TES or whatever, or whether it's CPD. We'll say a little bit about the way the reforms are affecting CPD and the CPD market, and the sort of format of training that teachers are interested in at the moment, which is changing quite quickly actually. We'll talk more about that. And just generally you'll see that there's a bit of, I've done the same presentation for teachers where we've gone into a lot of detail about the impact of accountability on schools. It may be, you just see the word poking out perhaps behind the chat pod that's on there. In fact, let's get rid of that chat pod now. The word accountability is something which has really cropped up an awful lot lately in terms of the new way that it's being measured. So we've had league tables for a long time, and now we've got a new version of the way schools are going to be held accountable, the floor standard, which is, floor standard means what kicks an Ofsted inspection off, basically. So if you fall below the floor, the phrase I hate using, but it is the one that's used, if you fall below the floor, then an Ofsted inspection is called. So just before we start, I'll just check that everyone can hear me. I'm typing that in. If you can hear me, if you can just type yes, then I'll just feel reasonably confident that at least things are okay at my end. Okay, good. And I guess if anyone can't, then at least they can hear that the problem must be at their end. So let me just yeah, okay, so I shall just move things around a little bit to resize them. So I'll leave this question pod open at the bottom here if there are any particular questions you'd like to ask, and otherwise I'll work the way through the presentation. What we're going to talk about then essentially is, I think I've done the introduction, these are things I'm going to focus on mainly. So curriculum reform, which in this case we're looking at Key Stage 3, GCSE, and a little bit about A-Level. There isn't too much definite about A-Level yet. Despite maybe some of the stories you've heard, it's still open, and we haven't heard definitely about some of those things. So I'll talk a bit about that. Assessment reform really impacts quite heavily on, well, it's starting at Key Stage 2, which I'll touch on again. I think Melissa talked about it on Monday night, but I'll also mention a bit about that. It's also impacting quite heavily on Key Stage 3, and of course everything's changing at GCSE and possibly quite considerably at A-Level as well. Accountability I've just mentioned quite briefly. Just going to say a little bit about maximising performance, because I think that does impact whatever offerings you have in schools. You'll see that although schools don't seem to be really aware of it yet, we think that there are going to be some fairly huge changes afoot in terms of what schools are doing from sorry, Louise. Yes, I've just seen your message come in. Yes, you are all on mute. If you do need to say anything, if you indeed, then I can hand over the microphone. But it's generally easier not to in these webinar systems. I should say, just before we start on that, and whilst following up on Louise's comment there. This format that we're using now is a bit like the way we do our online focus groups, except that in an online focus group you would all be on a simultaneous teleconference, which is completely separate from this online system, so that we use two completely different technologies which run side by side, so that if one fails we still have the other, although none ever has for more than a couple of minutes anyway. And our online focus groups are where we bring sometimes hundreds of teachers together, no, that's not true, dozens of teachers together to talk about all sorts of different things, and they are really effective in because you can talk to people from all over the world. I'm not sure, just looking at the names tonight, where everyone's from, but I know on Monday we had people from Jamaica and Colombia and China all dialing in at the same time, so anything's possible with this system. Anyway, so without any further ado, let's move on to the meaty stuff. So the new national curriculum, first of all, academies and free schools don't have to follow the national curriculum, but they tell us that they are generally following it pretty much verbatim. There are one or two schools that are doing really innovative things, and they've scrapped the national curriculum altogether, and they're just doing completely their own stuff. Although I assume, since they still have to end up at the end of, or at the start of GCSEs, I suppose, at roughly the same place, that they are building in similar sorts of content, but in general most schools, whatever the type they are following some version of the national curriculum. So if you're designing materials for use in the classroom, I wouldn't worry too much about following, you know, if you're intending that you'll base it all on the national curriculum and you're worried about the impact on, you know, sort of limiting your markets in non-academy schools and non-free schools, I wouldn't worry too much about it, because it will be relevant to most of what people do. Having said that, a lot of schools, although national curriculum is supposedly being phased in now, a lot are saying that they won't do anything until they've seen the final version of GCSEs. They do seem to be quite trusting of the specimen GCSEs, the draft GCSEs that are out at the moment, though, so they're hoping that those will be fairly accurate, and are starting to sort of think along those terms. And the reason I say that is that although the national curriculum is fairly detailed in some subjects, for others there's almost nothing. So it's better really to see where GCSE starts and then gear your whole Key Stage 3 content towards that. And it looks as if still schools aren't taking an awful lot of interest in what the Key Stage 2 content is either, for a lot of subjects. A lot of secondary schools seem to just forget that primary schools have ever done anything beforehand, and they just sort of start from scratch, which is sad, I suppose, for some Year 7 students, although it doesn't seem to be a particular issue, otherwise I suppose schools wouldn't do it. There are also these new performance descriptors coming up, so we'll talk more about that in terms of the A level, but again that kind of puts a hold on curriculum development until, because national curriculum levels are gone, again we'll say more about that later, it's difficult to know what the progress through a key stage is going to be, and schools say they're waiting for these new performance descriptors that are due out this term. Finalised versions are due out in December, but there should be a draft version before that. Because they're waiting for those, they say that they can't really plan the curriculum, but I think that's probably because they don't understand how limited these new performance descriptors are going to be. They're not like the old national curriculum level descriptors, they're just for the end of Key Stage 3 and 1 and 2. So they won't really help much in terms of knowing what content to put in. So again, if you're thinking about developing new resources for launching into school, yes, it would be worth taking a look at those when they come out, but they're not really going to help you an awful lot with knowing at what level the content should be pitched. It shouldn't be too different from the level at which it's pitched now, I suppose, is the best advice we can give there. The government says it's also encouraging innovation around the curriculum, so they're saying to Ofsted that if schools are doing some really different things with the curriculum, although the content should be, certainly for non-academies, the content should follow the national curriculum. They are allowed to sort of experiment with it, and the new mastery curriculum notion, so mastery curriculum has been around a long time, and it's basically saying you shouldn't move on to the next topic until students have mastered the topic that they're on. Fairly obvious from the title, I suppose. But a lot of a lot of what the government's saying about the way schools should be approaching the curriculum seems to be based around this mastery curriculum. For example, so there's no kind of national assessment scheme anymore for Key Stage 3 or 1 and 2, and the government's announced 10 Assessment Innovation Fund winners. I don't know if you've seen those. We have, I'm not sure if we've got something on our site about them actually now, but you can Google it, Assessment Innovation Fund. There are 10 of them, and they're sort of models of good practice in assessment for the new curriculum. And a lot of those follow this mastery curriculum model, so they have things like learning ladders, where you don't go on to the next rung until you've grasped the rung below, or mastered the rung, I think they say, which doesn't really seem to make much sense to me. Excuse me. So this is what teachers have said about it. They're not particularly worried about the introduction of any of this new curriculum stuff. Although there are differences and uncertainties, I think because they don't feel that the government's really putting any pressure on for various, I suppose for all 4 of those bullet points on the left, they're not really too worried about trying to get everything delivered straight away, and they're not too worried about their potential to be able to deliver it all straight away. But there are things that they will need to be concerned about, and I still am slightly concerned that a lot of schools aren't really coming to terms with the assessment stuff, which I'll talk about later. But at the moment, teachers aren't too bothered about it. So if you're thinking about your marketing messages for schools, I wouldn't pitch it at saying, notionally, you might not use these words, but notionally saying, are you worried about introducing the new curriculum? Well, here are some resources to support, blah, blah, blah. Because I think you'll find that most of them aren't worried about it, and so that, your marketing message will fall on deaf ears. I'll come on to some other things that might be a bit more useful later on. Secondary teachers are generally in favour of the changes that have happened to the primary curriculum. They think the new Key Stage 2 content is an improvement, although maths and languages teachers, I think, are slightly disappointed with what's happening. Maths is more difficult at Key Stage 2, but a lot of math teachers are worried actually that primary schools teachers won't have the skills and knowledge to be able to deliver some of that, and they're worried about getting a very mixed intake. So some schools will have taught content better than others, and so there'll be a bigger disparity in the quality of Year 7 learning, and similarly for MFL. Another major concern about everything to do with the new reforms, which I think this final bullet point on this slide will become more clear what I'm talking about as we go through, but really teachers have previously, at Key Stage 3 in particular, they've seen it as a time for engaging students in their subject, so engendering an interest in science or maths or whatever it might be, whereas the new accountability measures in particular seem to be putting a much bigger emphasis on performance rather than on just trying to get students engaged. So we've done some, actually I'll just pause on that previous slide. If there are any questions about any of that, I'll just give you a second just to type those in. I can see when you start typing, so if I don't see anyone start typing, I'll just carry on. Okay, good. So we've produced some mapping for anyone who has resources, schemes of working, etc., mapped to the old curriculum previously and need to update it to the new curriculum. These have been on the site for quite some time now, but I thought I'd just point them out in case you haven't heard them, found them. They're via that link on this slide, so you can either click on that now to get it, or I'll send round the PowerPoint presentation that I'm using now to everyone tomorrow, and you can just click through to it from there if you prefer. And just basically to say what it is, so over on the left hand side we've got the new national curriculum. We've added in some of our own coding, so the grey stuff at the start of there is because teachers have said to us that they've always valued the old the coding in the old curriculum, because it just means you can have a ready grid to show what you've covered rather than putting the whole thing. You can just put the number in. So we came up with that, our own version of that, which we used for, we've done some mapping for charities of their own resources, and we just developed it for that, so that we, there's an easy way to do that. We show the new content, which is in red. You might be surprised to find this is a Key Stage 2 maths sample we've got here. You might be surprised to find that money in pounds and pence is new to the national curriculum, but it is. And the orange stuff is obviously it's just moved to year group, and then the column over on the right is a commentary from one of our primary head teachers. So we had a panel of primary head teachers go through the English, maths and science curriculums and make these comments and map them and come up with that sort of coding that you can see there. So those are all online. They're there for Key Stage 1, 2 and 3 for the core subjects. Then there's not really enough detail in the new curriculum for the other subjects to make that worthwhile doing, and so we haven't. But there are lots, if you just Google it, there are lots of people who've done sort of short summaries of what the main changes are, and I think we'll probably have some of those on our own site as well. But I think these are the most useful things, and thousands of schools have downloaded these to use them since we came up with them, however long ago it was. So on to GCSE then. So the grades are all changing, which I'll talk more about later. That's just been finalised this week actually. The government's just, Ofqual's just put out a final announcement about that, which I'll say more about later. The main concerns about GCSE reforms at the moment are for the lower retainers, and you'll start to see why as we go through some of what the changes are. The range of vocational subjects is reduced quite considerably, so not just vocational qualifications, but also the sort of more vocational GCSE subjects are also in decline. The government also recently scrapped a lot of so-called similar subjects, which are these, and they've taken out things like digital communication because it's quite like some of the stuff they do in, I don't know, presumably IT, expressive arts because it's, there's already drama and dance as separate GCSEs, catering because it's like food technology, I suppose, and so on and so on. So they've just pulled all these, and they weren't attracting huge numbers of students nationally, but they're mostly subjects that were taken by lower retaining students, or that certainly they benefited lower retaining students quite considerably, because if you were good at, I don't know, food technology, you could do food tech and home economics and therefore get 2 GCSEs really for the price of 1.5 of them in terms of effort and understanding. And I think I don't know if it came from Ofqual or the DFE, but it's obviously been decided that that's a bit silly, and so they've pulled a raft of those. And I think it affects, if I remember rightly, about 100,000 exam entries a year will be affected by that. That's student subjects. Students per subject, whatever the word is. So that's again affecting the lower retainers. Another fairly major difference is that the content of GCSEs has been much more tightly specified for some subjects, and rolling on, then more subjects will be defined as they start to be come online to be rolled out. And again, I'll go through the programme a bit. But as they come online, the contents have been mapped so that whether you're doing AQA or WJC, the content is essentially the same. And the defined link there, you'll see when you get your PowerPoint, links you through to where the actual definitions are on the website if you want to look at those in more detail. Sample specifications are coming online now, coming quite thick and fast actually, in September, and I'll show you an example of those in a sec, and just how different they are. There's also, across all GCSEs, there will be more content involved. So it's not just that the assessment's getting harder, but it's also there's going to be more content being examined within GCSEs. And so again, you can imagine for the lower retaining students, that's a difficulty. It just makes everything tougher. The good news, if there is any, is, or if any of that's bad, I suppose, is that it's being phased in, not all subjects at once. And again, there's a link there to show you which subjects are coming on stream when, but essentially it's the core subjects first, and other subjects later on. So the GCSE specification, so depending on how big your monitor is, you may or may not be able to read these, but these are just pages from draft specifications. You'll see that this one, if you were to look at the common content specified by the DFE, you'd see it looks pretty much like that specification does. Whereas in this version, there's an awful lot more help and clarification for teachers and students, I suppose. It's linked to their old specifications. So if you are thinking that you're going to repurpose your resources in line with the new GCSEs, whilst you can be reasonably confident that if you choose some content to fit with one specification, it'll fit with another, I would look at each specification in turn to see which one's going to be most useful to you in revising or designing or checking that your content is still appropriate. Because if you just chose the first example in that draft spec there, you'd find an awful lot less help than in this second one. So there is quite a big difference if you look at them, and I imagine that each subject is different in each one, so just be careful what you look at, really. So a question here from Louise, was it? Lost it now. Sorry, I've lost the question now. I can't see it now, Louise, because I think it says, has GCSE combined science been scrapped? So Louise Robinson, it was Louise Green, Louise Robinson. Has combined science been scrapped? No, but single science has been scrapped. So you can no longer just do a single GCSE in combined science, if that's what you're talking about. It won't appear as part of the new accountability measures. So even if it were to exist, I doubt whether schools would be using it anyway. So double award and the 3 separate sciences are still in existence, but the single combined science GCSE won't be. You can do double award combined, but not single award. Okay, so on to assessment then. Here, the major change at Key Stage 3 is the removal of national curriculum levels. That's also gone from Key Stage 1 and 2. There simply aren't national curriculum levels anymore. In English and Maths at primary, there's a kind of equivalent of that because there are year group descriptions of what students need to learn. So in year 5 they'll learn this, in year 6 they'll learn this, which is kind of levelled on the assumption that it gets more difficult as you go through. But elsewhere there isn't anything equivalent to that. So schools now don't have any way of being able to judge the rate of progress through the Key Stage 3 science or maths or whatever it is. In some subjects that's relatively easy. So in maths is fairly hierarchical. Most year 9 content isn't suddenly going to switch places with year 7 content because it wouldn't make sense. The year 9 was always built on the stuff they'd learnt in year 7. So again, if you're producing resources aimed at or that has some maths content, then that probably won't change a huge amount, and certainly the order won't. If you've got stuff where the language is appropriate for year 9 now, it'll probably still be appropriate for year 9. But in other subjects that's not so easy. So history, for example, is really the radical differences there, and schools just don't know to what depth they're supposed to go in order to be able to cover it all off in a whole Key Stage 3. And more importantly, perhaps, that there's no way of assessing how much students have understood within a key stage. So previously there were levels, so whatever topic you're doing, you could do it at a range of different levels, and some students would do it at a higher level than others at the end of studying that topic. But now there's no way to measure that. And so a lot of schools are saying they're going to keep national curriculum levels. But I was at a meeting with the DFE in May, June time, and I put it to them that teachers were saying this, and they said, yeah, well, yes, that's what we thought they'd say, but they won't be able to keep them for very long, because whatever system they're using for assessment at Key Stage 3, they need to be able to convince Ofsted that they are doing something appropriate to know how well their students are progressing. And if they're using an old system, because obviously the old national curriculum levels, the content was mapped to the old content, not the new stuff. So it'll be difficult to persuade Ofsted inspectors of that after a few years. Now, if you've got resources which are still showing national curriculum levels, I wouldn't be in a hurry to get rid of them, because I think teachers will still find them useful. But when you're developing new ones, obviously you won't be able to do that. You'll need to find some other way of suggesting when that might be appropriate. So you might still say, well, we think this is more appropriate for Year 7, but you'll have to remember that schools might, particularly in something like history, where you think it might be in Year 7 because that's what half a dozen teachers have told you, you might find another half dozen teachers are doing that same content in Year 9. So it's not so obvious as it has been. I think that's going to be a difficulty if you're producing resources for schools, just making sure you've pitched it at the right level for Key Stage 3. So some of these other things here are perhaps a bit more, a bit less relevant to you if you're producing resources, except that quite commonly you'll find with a classroom resource that the assessments that are built into it, the sort of formative assessment things, might be an exercise, an activity that's a task that you're asking children to do during a lesson. Previously you might have said we're targeting levels 5, A, B and C with this, might be a bit of a spread, 5A and B with this particular question. Whereas now you can be a bit more flexible in that. So English teachers, for example, are really pleased in general that national curriculum levels have gone, because they found them really constraining in terms of their assessments. They want to be able to set something and say, well, this, it may only be, may have poor grammar, but look at the imagination in this, or, so you can actually, if you're producing those tasks, you can be a bit less constrained in trying to target national curriculum levels. So that's a bit of good news, I suppose. Another thing which has, again, it might not really particularly impact on your resources, but previously schools have used national curriculum levels at Key Stage 3 and then switched over to GCSE grades at Key Stage 4, and that's been fine. It's not bothered them too much because they understand how one translates into the other. But now they can't be sure of anything because obviously no levels and GCSE grades are changing. So a lot of schools are saying they're going to a more integrated approach, where they perhaps will start with GCSE grades all the way through Key Stage 3, which is the final point on there. Although a lot of schools don't like that because you make very slow progress in a GCSE grade. You could be stuck at the new grade, what is the last one? 1, for a long time. You'd start on level 1, a grade 1 at Year 7, you could still be there at the end of Year 8. So not too useful. So again, if you're thinking about how to map your new resources to the new assessment schemes, you'll find that really difficult, and unfortunately there is no good answer to it, and it doesn't look as if there's going to be an answer to it either. So it might almost be better, you'll need to talk to teachers about it, but it might be better just to sort of think again about anything that you're doing about notifying teachers the level at which the tasks that you're asking of them in their curriculum resources. Okay, I'll just pause for a drink of water. Any more questions there if you'd just like to type them in via the chat pod? Okay, so assessments are getting tougher, in particular at GCSE, but also at Key Stage 3, and well, A-levels, I suppose GCSE and A-level both started now in terms of the way assessments are being sat or taken. So I was I'm chair of governors at a very successful comprehensive school. It's one of the top comps in the country, and they discovered this year that we discovered, I suppose I should say, the A-level results had taken a bit of a dive. In fact, quite a considerable dive compared to last year, and it seems to be because although students had been doing module tests in Year 12, in Year 13 they weren't, and that left them all a bit high and dry. It meant the staff didn't know enough about how the progress they were making, and it meant the students didn't have a sort of pre-test, a sort of valid mock test early in the year. And so that seems to have had a bit of an impact. So that's something that's already in place, and that's already, schools are already looking for things that they can use to try and overcome that. So maybe if you are thinking about resources, it would be good to try to come up with something which would be supporting students specifically in terms of exam preparation. That's always been a good tip for curriculum resources, but really for the next maybe 5 years, that's going to be absolutely crucial, because there'll be no specimen papers for GCSEs or A-levels because they're all changing. The old ones will all be irrelevant, and they'll be the wrong style, they'll be the wrong content. So anything that you can do to come up with valid sort of assessment materials that students can practice on, I think you'll find really useful to get in terms of getting your stuff into schools. I think they'll find that there'll be a lot of demand for those kind of things. Again, we said about lower attaining pupils that the sheer difficulty of new A levels itself, aside from all the other things we've talked about, is a cause for concern. So if you are developing new resources which are targeting exam practice, then obviously the lower ability ones are going to need it more. I mean, I know that's always the case, but I think it's even more so now. And in fact, even probably the middle range students, I think, will probably could do with more help. And I'll say a bit more about the spread of targeting ability groups in a minute. So measuring progress is a major change, and I'll talk more about that later. But essentially, at the moment, schools are measured on the percentage of students they get over the CD boundary in 5 subjects, particularly in English and maths. That's all going to change. I'll talk more in more detail about that in a bit. But one of the key things about the way assessment is changing is that schools don't have anything to measure that against. There's nothing from the start of year 7 to the end of year 9 that schools can use to measure that progress against. Now that's going to make schools really nervous. Target setting is something that's really common in schools. Students are routinely set targets. The progress towards meeting the targets is monitored, and that's a huge mechanism that simply won't work anymore. Whatever schools are using, it won't be accurate anymore. They'll be predicting grades that don't even have the right nomenclature. There'll still be letters instead of numbers. The relation between boundaries is only clear for 3 grades, not for all of them. So lots of things going on in this progress stuff, and I'll say more about what that is in a little bit. But also, schools are being expected to target pupil premium students, and pupil premium is the Lib Dem innovation, which is essentially there is a correlation between social deprivation and performance in schools, and so whilst it wouldn't perhaps have made more sense to target the funding at people who just generally needed support rather than on their social background, nevertheless pupil premium is targeting social background, and so the government's extra funding is given for this. It's not much on top of what they would have had otherwise, although it is increasing, particularly in primary schools this year. But because they're giving this money, which is supposedly ring-fenced, schools are supposed to be showing how much progress their pupil premium students have made during that, the Key Stage 3, for example. But schools are spending it mostly on staffing, which they're spending the money on anyway, so it isn't really, as far as we can tell anyway, having a huge impact, despite what you read from the government about the impact of it. The evidence we're getting back from schools is that most of it is being spent on support staff, for example, which they would have employed anyway, but it just makes it a bit easier to afford other things. So all money in schools has some impact, but I don't know that you could as reliably say that it's had as much an impact as possible. But measuring progress in that particular cohort of students is going to be much more important. So again, anything that you can, if you're developing resources, if you can do something that's supporting children from those sort of socially deprived backgrounds, those low attaining backgrounds, those are all likely to have a better impact on those pupil premium students and therefore be better received in schools, in theory. The way Key Stage 3 is being assessed is changing. So without national curriculum levels, there's now going to be this, I'm telling you this for sort of general interest, I'm not sure how much relevance you'll find in it, but there's going to be an average scaled score, so the average in every cohort score will be 100. So if you're a student and you get 100, then you're exactly average. If you're less than that, are you going to be seen as a failure? And how do you report that to parents? You know, your student is less than average, your student is average, or your student is above average. How do they know that 98 is kind of still pretty much average? Where, you know, they won't have any sense of where the barriers lie. So it'll be difficult for schools, this. It'll also be difficult in terms of the formative assessment. So again, you know, where I was saying earlier about the fact that you could previously have indicated the level of a task by showing national curriculum levels. The scaled scores won't give you any help there at all, because schools just won't know what they are until the SATs have been taken, or the teacher assessments have been made, or whatever else is going to happen in Key Stage 3 in each subject. They won't know what the average scores are going to be. So assessment is a big issue. The DFE and the National Association of Head Teachers have set out these assessment principles, but we commissioned panels of teachers to look at these, and they said, well, the DFE ones are so thin that they're meaningless. The NEHT ones, whilst being detailed, are really just saying what we're doing anyway. We don't particularly want to change what we're doing because we've been doing it a long time, we understand it, parents understand it, our systems are built around it. Really, we'd like to just stay doing what we're doing. But they don't know how to benchmark students anymore. They won't, you know, so they won't know. If you look at the moment with national curriculum levels, benchmarking means that if someone's on level 5C, you know roughly where they are in the national picture of things compared to everybody else in the country. At level 5C is the same. Now there's nothing there to help with that. The government said they wanted the teaching schools, this new group of about 400 schools around the country, to help support with the new assessment regime, but teaching schools don't seem to be doing it. So one or two have. Some of those Assessment Innovation Fund winners with teaching schools, but in general teaching schools are sort of doing their own things, and if it happens to be assessment then fine, but generally it isn't to do with that, because as I say, most schools are happy with it and there just hasn't been the demand. So assessment reform it's all up in the air. It's very difficult for schools to come to terms with, and it will be something to keep an eye on, because it's, whilst we're saying that the schools are happy with content, we can understand why they're happy with content, and that seems reasonable and sensible, but whilst they're saying they're happy with their current assessment systems, we feel quite concerned that that's not going to be appropriate for them. Certainly at the end of 2 years' time, I think schools will find that their current assessment systems are woefully inadequate if they haven't updated them somehow. So on to GCSE grades, and this is a fairly major change, and again, as I've said, that's just all happened this year. This week, it's just been finalised. We conducted a report, a research project when the first GCSE grade consultation came out last term, and we asked about a whole range of things, some of which have now come to fruition. So we've updated that report and taken out the things, or updated the things that we no longer need to worry about. So that's there. Again, you can either download that now or link through to it at your leisure later. And the major things about it are that where there were 8 grades, there are now 9, and it's the upper grade, an additional upper grade really that's come in, which is better in terms of differentiation for the more able students, but actually mostly where schools need more differentiation is lower down. So a lot of teachers said to us, wouldn't it be nice if we could make it 10 grades, which is a nice round number, and we could have an additional grade lower down, but that's not happened. So we forgot about it. The DFE again this week has officially said that these next few grade boundaries that I'm showing you are the way that the new GCSEs will be set initially. So the new grade 4 will be exactly equivalent to a grade C, 7 exactly equivalent to an A, and 9 exactly equivalent to the upper half of A star. But those aren't permanent, of course, because in a few years' time we can forget about their equivalence with the A grades, because the grades will have a meaning in their own right. So these are really here just to emphasise to schools where they should be pitching and what they can be expecting from the performance. Remember, the old grade C was the pass rate, or current grade C was the pass rate for subjects. Well, the new grade 4 is going to be the pass rate, but that's going to rise to 5 over the period of the next few years. So, as I say, not only are assessments getting tougher, the content getting more detailed, but the barrier over which pupils have to pass to get a pass grade, effectively, is also being elevated. The good news is that the bottom grade, grade 1, has been pegged to the current G. So in the initial proposal they weren't sure about whether F or G should be the case. We very strongly made the case for keeping it at G on the basis of our consultation with teachers when we met with Ofqual. I had quite a heated argument actually with the person leading the consultation, and I think we won, or certainly they saw sense anyway. So that's good news, because a lot of students, the students who really aren't likely to get a GCSE grade in your subject, you might be targeting them at a grade G on the hope that they'll get it, because basically you can't offer them anything else. That's quite a common situation in schools, although not with huge numbers of students, obviously. So schools really wanted to keep that G so they could offer something. So another fairly important aspect for subjects that have had tiering previously, they won't have tiering anymore. The only ones that are going to keep tiering are maths and sciences. So for everybody else, they're being lumped in all to do the same paper. So where some subjects previously had a higher or a foundation paper they could be entered for, now they'll have to do just one paper. Again, that's off-putting for low retaining pupils, but also not particularly great for high retaining pupils either, because they have to go through these really too easy questions for them at the start, which isn't a huge issue, but it is something that the teachers have said about. Not all grades are going to have descriptors. So at the moment, the grades which are mentioned in the document that's produced this week and that I've illustrated there are the only ones that are going to be described, and then the grades in between those will just be, so if there are 3 grades between the 2 that are defined, then you sort of split the marks 3 ways between those grades, so it's just an even split. So at least that's easy to understand, I suppose. It's just that it does mean it'll change year on year. And the fact that there's going to be a standardised test doesn't seem to make an awful lot of difference. What that means is that the standardised test is something that a sample of students will sit. They may not all sit the whole test, and they won't know what they are, and the teachers will never see the questions. So this is something like goes on at Key Stage 2 for science at the moment. These standardised tests are they're a sample test, and they're just used to make sure that grade inflation doesn't get out of hand again. So accountability is a fairly major change, as I've mentioned, and again there's an awful lot of detail for this which I won't go into, except just to give you this brief overview of what it is. So it's called Performance 8, or P8. Sorry, it's called Progress 8, not Performance 8, Progress 8. And what this means is that for those 3 core subjects of English, Lit, Lang and Maths, they have potentially a double weighting. So schools, well, first of all, individual students will have an attainment 8 measure based on these 8 subjects, and because 2 of them can be double weighted, that's effectively 10 subjects. So you add the grades up across these 8 subjects and divide by 10, with English and Math being double weighted, and then you've got a score. So these are the ones that are going to count for something. Maths and English Lit will be double weighted. English language will be double weighted if literature is also taken, which is a confusing thing that, again, schools really haven't quite got their head around yet. Does it mean they have to take it, but do they have to sit it as well? Do they have to pass it? Nobody knows. They can then do, so just some examples from the middle blue band there. So for example, they need to do 3 of those. They could do a double award science and geography, or they could do French, Spanish and German. I suppose they could just do 3 languages in there, and that would be fine. Any combination thereof of those 3 of those subjects is okay. And then any other subject on a special list that the DFE will update every year and will include vocational subjects. They'll carry a weighting of 1 and they have to do 3 of those. So the 8 is basically made up of English and Maths is 2, one of those other EBAC subjects is the blue ones there, 5, and then 3 of the other subjects at the end. So what you then do as a school is you add up for all your subjects and for all your students and divide by the number of students, and that gives you a Progress 8 measure. That gives you an Attainment 8 measure based on the GCSE grades that they've got. But the important thing is that for each year group going through, the attainment they've got will be compared against their Key Stage 2 attainment in English and Maths. So if they have a high Key Stage 2 score, then they'll need to have an even higher GCSE grade in order for your progress measure to be appropriate. If it isn't, so imagine you've got a high intake, so like the school I'm governor at, we have a reasonably high Key Stage 2 intake and we have a really high GCSE result. So for us, we're not worried about this because we know that we add a lot of progress as they go through. The grammar school down the road, on the other hand, their GCSE grades aren't all that much better than ours, but their intake is much, much higher. Now, that's not showing at the moment because SATs only go to level 5, whereas their students, because it's a really high intake grammar, most of their students are actually at level 6. So when they get their new Key Stage 2 scores, their starting point, their baseline Key Stage 2 score, is going to be much higher than ours. So we think that their progress is going to plummet, and we've already seen them starting to do things about that. So this is why the progress thing is, it's a big issue in schools, which the effect of which hasn't really been felt yet, but will really come into play later on. Now, what that means is that when it does start to have an impact, schools will become really concerned about monitoring the progress through Key Stage 3. Because if you know what your Key Stage 2 data is when you come in, so for every student that comes in Year 7, you'll know what grade they have to get at GCSE in order for you to have shown that you've added some value to it. If you don't add any value to it, so if all your students just get what they should get, your added value is 0 and you're going to have Ofsted coming and knocking at the door. So you have to have shown some improvement over what's anticipated. Now what's anticipated will be based on what students tend to get, so it's a vicious circle, and we think schools are going to really start to be worried about this. And we've done some research to ask schools about how they're going to approach doing this, but I'll just say a little bit about what some of the issues are, and then I'll say a little bit about how we think schools are going to approach it. But I don't want to go into an awful lot of detail about that because I think that's probably more than you need. But there is lots of stuff on our website which is showing what some of these, the way some of the schools are going to approach this. If you're interested, you can go onto the website and read about it. So teachers are generally positive about this idea of greater emphasis on progress because if you think about it, it is much fairer. You know, if you're teaching in a school with a low intake and therefore get low GCSEs, on the current measures, you've not done anything. You know, you're doing badly. On the new measures, even if you've got students who are low performing, they could now make a much more significant contribution. Now, potentially it's easier to add value to boost the performance of low attaining students than it is to boost the performance of high attaining students. Obviously, they've got more room to make progress. So those schools which have a low intake particularly feel positive about this greater emphasis on progress. And actually most teachers are, regardless of what the ability is, because they think it's just fairer. And although, we hear a lot about schools being very competitive, generally they just want what's fair for the students. They don't really, it's not really about whether they're better than another school at the end of the day. Mostly it's about getting students the right grades and doing right by everybody. And that's a really common, strong emotion that teachers share with us during our research. EBAC had, because it was only 5 subjects like D and T, which were non-EBAC subjects, under that EBAC measure, they'd really suffered. The students were being steered away from non-EBAC subjects, but this new Performance 8 means that there are now three subjects left which schools could offer to students and still be part of the accountability measures. So that's much better for subjects like D and T. So those subjects are feeling a lot happier about it. However, there are still some subjects which won't appear in the 8, subjects which aren't on the DFE's approved list every year. So vocational subjects will be limited to 1. So if you're a school that, if you have a very low performing cohort, you might have a lot of those traditionally having done vocational subjects. Those would have counted to some extent, although it's been reduced in recent years, towards your performance data. Well, that's still going to suffer, although not as much as EBAC obviously, but it will still be an issue there. So that's what teachers have said generally, how they're feeling about it. And really just a quick look at, just to summarise what I was saying about the assessment and the way that will need to change. And again, if you're producing resources which are focusing on content, mostly that's what charities do with their resources, content and skills, I should say. So if your charity is focusing on trying to generate an interest in a particular sort of subject area like global education, or if you're trying to engender certain skills like resilience in students, you're probably doing that through a resource focus, which is essentially attracting teachers to the content and then getting in the other messages about the skills or the values or the ethos that your charity is trying to promote. They're kind of integrated into the content, but it's the content that tends to be the hook, although sometimes it's skills as well. We think because content is so ubiquitous now, Google and TES is now absolutely ridiculous. If you try finding anything on TES, there is just so much stuff there, and it's all created by teachers, it's all targeted at the curriculum, and it's virtually all content based. If you are thinking about developing new resources, it may be that if you can do something towards assessment, which then feeds into accountability obviously, particular assessment aligned to progress, then that's likely to be a more distinctive feature, a much stronger USP for teachers than yet more content is. So that's a fairly key message. It's also a very difficult thing to achieve, I think. It's also a very obscure area to be targeting, obscure in that we're all a bit uncertain about how it's going to play out ultimately. It's also very varied because all schools could potentially be doing something different with their assessment, but that's an area that you should really be taking a very close look at. And I've just highlighted on this slide here some of the things which are different about, these are actually the way current assessment practices generally work, but which we think are likely to change. So where we've underlined things there, it's to show how things are, the sort of main areas of change that's going to happen. The distrust of Key Stage 2 data, I'm not sure I mentioned that. This is to say that most, particularly maths, but in other subjects too, they distrust Key Stage 2 data, and this is going to be really important because all that progress measure that I've just been describing is based on progress from Key Stage 2. difficult if you don't trust the data that you're basing your progress on. Even more difficult if it's based only on maths and English performance and you're teaching RE or history or design technology. How can you be sure that their performance in English and maths tells you anything about how they should be doing in those subjects? Well, very, very difficult. Again, that's something that is just going to have to change with time. It's not feasible for it to carry on as it is now. Anyway, so I've talked a fair bit about those things, but all these things that we've said here are things that we think what schools are doing now, they won't necessarily be able to carry on doing in the future, and so they really will need a lot of support over that. If you're thinking we don't know anything about assessment in our organisation, it is something that you should find out about, because whatever you do, assessment is, even if it was to carry on being exactly the same. So even if I said, none of those things are going to change in my school, the fact that assessment is going to become more important in itself is something that you need to be thinking about. So if all your resources don't really do what teachers want them to do for assessment now, they certainly won't do them for what's going to be coming in future, because it's all changed and it's not anything that you will have designed in previously. We know a lot about assessment at School Zone. It's something that we deal with day in, day out. It's a standard part of our sort of knowledge base. I've got a master's degree in assessment, for example, which is perhaps a bit why I'm banging on about it. But it is something really crucial to what schools will need to change. Just to say, if you are interested in schools generally, I've mentioned a fair bit about the progress measure, that first bullet point on the screen now, because that's the thing that triggers Ofsted, and that will be the main thing that schools are reported on. But there are all these other things as well. So I've mentioned progress, but they'll also have to show the attainment across those subjects for all their students. The percentage of students achieving a grade C, so not just the 5 subjects, but in total. They'll still have to show the EBAC scores, and they'll also, for schools with 6th forms and colleges, sorry, not for that, for schools in general, they'll have to show where their students are going after they've finished their GCSEs. There's a separate lot for A-level, which I haven't mentioned. Schools will also have a widget, so if you are looking to work with schools, for example, in future, you'll be able to have a quick look at their website and see where they are in terms of progress and attainment and EBAC scores and English and maths, because they will have to have this widget on their school website that shows this data, and this is data drawn directly from the DFE, so they can't fudge it. This is what the government's planning anyway. I suspect they don't know the range of technologies used in school websites, and I wouldn't mind betting that under 50% of schools will actually be able to accommodate their widget. Anyway, I might be proved wrong on that one. So just this final slide, really, just to emphasise about the maximising performance issue, and just really to hammer home what it is. So imagine you're a school, you've got a year 10 group just started this year. You would expect their prior attainment to look something like this, and I've deliberately left the scale on the left blank, the vertical scale blank, because you could measure it on any particular scale. So it could be SAT scores, it could be some baseline test that you've just administered to your group. You'd expect a normal distribution of students within a year group, whatever those 10 decile points are. That would be, your performance would look something like that. The government had talked about giving students a decile score in their initial proposal, but that's gone. So if you've come across that decile thing as part of SATS reporting, you can forget about it now, which is why I've just illustrated that with a cross. You'd expect that your performance would end up with, this is on the current GCSE grades, I've kept it as it is now for simplicity. You'd expect that your distribution of GCSE grades would sort of roughly measure that. So we've got 8 GCSE grades here from those 10 decile places. You'd expect that your GCSE grades would be sort of follow the same sort of distribution as the original one, give or take, and you would be targeting the students who are at this boundary between grade C and D, particularly because those are the ones that your schools be measured on. So the percentage of students getting a grade C is really what you're interested in. So you're trying to get as many students over that boundary as you possibly can. But what's changing because of these progress measures is that now you have to get as many students up into the next boundary as you possibly can. So you don't just want them all sitting in the nearest grade, because if they're just achieving what the prediction is based on the progress, the attainment they've made at the end of Key Stage 2, if they're only achieving what you predict them to achieve, your value added, your progress score, is 0, which is bad. So you've got to target getting all those students up into the next grade. So traditionally, a lot of effort's gone in schools into getting students over that boundary in the middle, that CD boundary, but now they're going to have to target every single grade boundary to try and get as many students up into the next one as they possibly can. So you may well find that your resources at the moment, if they've been particularly popular, have a look at what sort of level they're targeting. If it's something that schools have thought would be useful in targeting that CD boundary, for example, they're going to find those less useful now. They'll only be appropriate for that one grade boundary, whereas all grade boundaries now need to be addressed. Now, schools have also, in order to do this, they are adopting all sorts of different approaches. Anyway, so what they're doing, for example, is they are directing students towards EBAC subjects. Some schools have a really strong EBAC score, and so the more students you get into the EBAC, the better your Progress 8 measure will be, because the EBAC subjects are subsumed into that. Some are targeting those other subjects, so where your EBAC score might be relatively low, you've got 3 other subjects now to play with in the new Progress 8 measures. And some schools are saying that, well, what if instead of entering them for an additional humanities subject, what if we enter them for business studies instead? Because it's easier to get higher grades in business studies. In EBAC that wouldn't have been any use at all, but in the Progress 8 measure that boosts us quite significantly. Or what about instead of having our students do 8 subjects and getting a grade C, we put them in for 5 subjects, give them extra time, boost them higher. 2 of those subjects will be English and Maths, obviously, so you're doubling those as well. What if across 5 subjects they get enough of a higher grade that their overall attainment grade is higher? Therefore our progress grade across the whole school is higher, and therefore we come out with a better performance. So there are all sorts of ways that schools are already saying that they're going to be playing the game there. And I won't sort of bore you with going into all those, but there are quite a lot of them. Also just wanted to show you where you can get some more information about all this stuff. If you're finding that it's a bit mind-boggling, everything I've been talking about just now, I'm just going to see if I can show you something we've got on our site, just by way of illustration what other things that you could look at. I'm just trying to get... sorry, I forgot how to log in. Okay, so let me just try and share this. Okay, so you may have a rather condensed view of this if you're just looking at it in the pod. In the chat pod, by the way, there's a button where you can go full screen. I think it's up in the top right hand corner, sort of 4 arrows thing. So if you need to make it full screen to be able to read it, you can, but it's really just to illustrate what it is. So on our website we've got this section called New Curriculum, and it's where we write articles and guides and summaries and provide feedback from teachers about all sorts of information which we generate through our research with teachers. And this one here is looking at the kind of stuff that we've been talking about just now. And you'll see, I'll just scroll down it, we've got a primary reforms guide. You can go to that, and it's the primary version of this one, which is for secondary. There's a webinar of some of the findings that we've got here, which is it's pretty much the same content as we just talked about now, but aimed at teachers, so with a lot more detail about, particularly about the stuff I was talking about at the end, for example. We've got core changes to the national curriculum, which is the documents I've just been talking about. We've got a full research report that we've done about the secondary curriculum, and we've also added in these commentaries, which you just need to click on these buttons to add. So what we've done is try to summarise what the changes are, and then we've added our own commentaries based around what teachers have told us. And there are lots of things like this on our site. I think there's probably something about every reform that we've talked about tonight, and every reform that's actually underway. So we do investigate all kinds of things all the time, and that's all there. If you want to find stuff, then by all means look on the site. If you have any questions at any time, we're always happy just to answer anything on the phone. So there's a question here from Liz, I noticed, which I'll try and answer now if I can. So I can't seem to read things on this computer very well. Let me just see if I can. So if you have any questions that you want answering, please just ask away, and just give us a phone call, and we'll try and answer them straight away if we know the answer. And if not, we can probably tell you where to look, or even go away and. If we don't know the answer, we probably want to know the answer, and we'll go and find out and call you back. So please do just feel free to treat it as a sort of online help. And I'll talk to you next time. Bye bye.